Countess Isolde's world was one of opulence, a dazzling tapestry of gold and velvet, where every corner of the castle shimmered with wealth and every corridor whispered secrets long buried. From the outside, it seemed a life of privilege and refinement, a life many could only dream of. Yet beneath this glittering exterior lay a current of tension, rivalry, and ambition that few dared to speak of. The castle itself, a sprawling labyrinth of stone halls and ornate chambers, served as both a stage and a cage, confining its inhabitants in an endless dance of appearances and allegiances. Countless torches illuminated tapestries depicting heroic ancestors, yet their silent eyes seemed to judge those who walked beneath them, reminding all who entered that nobility demanded more than charm and manners. It demanded power, cunning, and sometimes cruelty. Isolde moved through this world with grace and precision, every gesture calculated, every smile measured to convey warmth while concealing intent. She was admired for her intelligence, her wit, and her ability to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics without losing her composure. Nobles whispered about her beauty, but those closest knew that it was her mind that truly commanded respect, a mind capable of seeing patterns others could not, of anticipating moves before they were made, and of exploiting weaknesses hidden behind the veneer of civility. In a place where alliances were as fragile as crystal and betrayal often came in the form of a well-timed compliment or a shared toast, Isolde thrived. She understood that appearances were more than superficial, they were survival. The royal feasts, which took place in grand halls with ceilings so high that candles flickered like distant stars, were both spectacles and battlegrounds. Servants scurried silently between tables, balancing trays heavy with delicacies, while musicians filled the air with harmonious notes that masked the undercurrent of tension in every conversation. Courtiers, adorned in silks and jewels, mingled, exchanged compliments, and formed temporary alliances, each smile hiding ambition and each laugh a potential weapon. In such an environment, Isolde was in her element. She observed, she calculated, and she maneuvered, knowing that every glance could be a threat or an opportunity. She was never careless, never distracted. The stakes were too high, and the cost of misstep too great. Even the seemingly trivial details of court life carried weight. A misplaced cup, a forgotten bow, or a delayed response could be perceived as disrespect, providing ammunition for enemies waiting in the shadows. Isolde recognized the power of perception and carefully curated her image, ensuring that she remained both admired and feared. Her charm drew people in, yet those who looked too closely sometimes glimpsed the glimmer of something darker beneath the surface, a mind willing to bend rules, manipulate events, and, if necessary, remove obstacles without hesitation. Such traits were whispered about, but rarely confronted openly. To do so was to invite danger. Despite the grandeur, there was an ever-present sense of unease. Rivalry among the nobility was constant, like an invisible storm brewing just beyond the walls. Every courtier carried ambitions, every noble harbored grudges, and every servant held secrets, all of which could shift the delicate balance of power in an instant. Alliances were temporary, friendships were fragile, and loyalty was often a currency traded for advantage. In this charged atmosphere, Isolde's brilliance lay not only in her intelligence, but in her capacity for observation and patience. She noticed details that others dismissed, a slight hesitation in a bow, a lingering glance at a neighboring seat, a whispered conversation paused abruptly as she entered a room. Each fragment of information was catalogued in her mind, later to be used with surgical precision. The Countess's reputation was further strengthened by her ability to host feasts that combined magnificence with subtle displays of power. Guests marveled at the sumptuous banquets, the elaborate dances, and the artistry of the musicians, often unaware that every seating arrangement, every order of service, and even the placement of candles was orchestrated to reinforce Isolde's dominance. By controlling the environment, she not only showcased her wealth, but subtly reminded everyone of her authority and strategic brilliance. Her events were social theater in its purest form, where every smile, every toast, and every compliment carried layered meaning, and every action was a message, understood by some and invisible to others. Yet, beneath all this, Isolde carried a secret, a darkness that even the most astute courtiers failed to perceive. Her ambition was not merely political. It was personal, an obsessive drive to eliminate threats and secure her position at all costs. Those who underestimated her did so at their peril, for she was capable of acts that were both calculated and merciless. While the court saw a poised, elegant noblewoman, a closer look would reveal the quiet intensity in her gaze, the cold deliberation in her movements, and the eerie calm with which she observed potential rivals. It was a calm that promised danger, though few recognized it for what it truly was. In this gilded world, where every gesture mattered and appearances often concealed deadly intentions, Countess Isolde thrived. The glittering halls, the candlelit feasts, the laughter of courtiers, and the beauty of silk and gold were all parts of a stage upon which she performed, but the true drama lay in the shadows. Beneath the elegance, beneath the charm and sophistication, there was a lurking tension, a brewing storm of envy, fear, and ambition that threatened to erupt. The audience could sense that behind every smile, every toast, and every polite bow, something more sinister was waiting, something that would shatter the illusions of safety and civility. It was in this delicate balance between glamour and menace, between celebration and calculation, that the story of Countess Isolde began. Every lavish meal, every whispered compliment, and every gesture of courtesy carried the weight of potential betrayal. The castle, as beautiful and grand as it was, served as both a playground and a trap, a place where the brightest minds could rise or be destroyed. And it was here, amid this glittering facade of nobility, that Countess Isolde's dark secrets silently gathered momentum, waiting for the moment when it would emerge from the shadows to shock everyone who believed in the innocence of appearances. Behind the glittering halls and shimmering chandeliers of Countess Isolde's world, there existed a realm few ever glimpsed, a world of whispered schemes, silent rivalries, and the constant hum of tension that threaded itself through every corridor and chamber. While outsiders admired her elegance and intelligence, the inner workings of her life were far more complex and shadowed. Countless nobles vied for influence, each hoping to gain an advantage, each carrying ambitions and grudges that could explode at any moment. Isolde understood this better than anyone. She knew that charm alone would not protect her, that alliances could dissolve overnight, and that every smile could hide a dagger. She had learned early that the most dangerous threats were rarely loud or obvious. They whispered, plotted, and struck from the dark. Isolde's mind was as sharp as it was disciplined. She observed constantly, noticing the flicker of hesitation in a rival's gaze, the subtle curl of a lip as insults were masked as compliments, the way servants carried messages between factions. Every detail mattered because every detail could be used to her advantage. While the court busied itself with feasts and festivities, she was already planning, calculating probabilities, assessing loyalties, and determining who might one day pose a threat. It was this combination of intellect and patience that set her apart. She did not act impulsively. She waited, watched, and then struck when the moment was precise, when the outcome could be controlled and the risk minimized. Her rivals were many, each possessing qualities that threatened her position. Some were older nobles, seasoned by years of court life and respected for their family name and wealth. Others were younger, ambitious, and clever, seeking to climb the hierarchy through charm, deceit, or the favor of powerful figures. All of them underestimated Isolde at their peril. She had mastered the art of appearing harmless, of projecting warmth and sophistication, while simultaneously collecting intelligence, identifying weaknesses, and understanding the underlying fears and desires that motivated her enemies. To her, people were not merely companions or adversaries. They were pieces on a board, each move carefully orchestrated to secure her position. The psychological tension within the castle was palpable. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones, careful not to reveal too much, wary that words could be twisted, overheard, or used against them. Rumors traveled faster than truth, and a casual remark could ignite suspicion or ruin a reputation. In such an environment, trust was a fragile commodity, one that Isolde valued and manipulated in equal measure. She understood human nature. the dark impulses hidden behind civility and decorum, and she used that understanding to influence outcomes subtly. A well-timed smile, a discreet gift, or an expression of empathy could lull rivals into complacency, making them vulnerable to her next move. Isolde's own personal history had honed these skills. While the details of her early life were shrouded in the usual mixture of fact and legend, it was clear that ambition had driven her from an early age. She had learned that power required not only intellect, but emotional control, that showing vulnerability could be fatal, and that patience often yielded rewards far greater than hasty action. Every encounter, every conversation, and every observation became part of a vast mental ledger, cataloging opportunities and threats alike. Her mind was a labyrinth, one she navigated with meticulous care, and one that few outsiders ever glimpsed in its entirety. Within this shadowed world, Isolde also confronted darker impulses, an unspoken fascination with control and dominance that went beyond mere survival. She enjoyed testing limits, observing reactions, and subtly manipulating events to see how others responded. It was a dangerous curiosity, one that could have destroyed her if mishandled, yet she wielded it with precision. The line between strategy and obsession was thin, but she balanced it carefully, aware that a single misstep could unravel everything she had worked to build. To the court, she was a paragon of grace. In private, she was a master of calculation, capable of wielding fear and uncertainty like instruments in a symphony, orchestrating outcomes to suit her will. Even those closest to her sensed that there was more than met the eye. Servants noticed the intensity in her gaze, the quiet deliberation behind casual gestures, and the way she seemed to know things she should not. Advisors admired her intellect, but occasionally felt a chill when her sharp mind cut too close to their own ambitions. Countless nobles who crossed paths with her felt the subtle pressure of her presence, as if every conversation and interaction carried hidden weight. And yet, few could place the exact nature of the danger she represented. This ability to inspire both admiration and unease made her uniquely formidable, a presence both magnetic and unsettling. The tension intensified when Isolde began to identify specific threats, individuals whose influence or popularity could challenge her dominance, whose ambitions might one day overshadow her carefully constructed position. Unlike many nobles who acted impulsively or relied solely on charm, she observed, documented, and plotted in silence. She never underestimated the value of patience, understanding that an opportune moment could turn the tables completely. Her strategy was always long-term, aiming not merely to neutralize threats, but to eliminate them entirely when necessary, without leaving trace or suspicion. This shadowed realm of planning and observation set the stage for what would come next. The court continued its public performance of laughter, feasts, and celebration, unaware of the meticulous preparations unfolding behind the scenes. Every whispered word, every subtle gesture, and every carefully placed glance contributed to an intricate tapestry of anticipation, tension, and impending danger. Isolde's dark secret was not merely a possibility. It was an inevitability, a slow-moving storm gathering in the hidden chambers of her mind, ready to descend with precision and finality. It was in this hidden world of strategy, observation, and subtle menace that Countess Isolde truly came alive. While her public persona dazzled the court and commanded respect, her private persona, calm, deliberate, and unyielding, was a force that few could comprehend. The shadows behind the velvet curtains were filled with ambition, calculation, and the quiet promise of chaos. And it was here, in this delicate balance between observation and action, that the seeds of the fateful feast, the event that would shock the nobility and reveal her darkness, were quietly sown. The day of the feast arrived like a ripple through the castle, every corridor and chamber infused with anticipation, excitement, and an unspoken tension that only those attuned to the undercurrents of court life could sense. The hall had been transformed into a cathedral of opulence, with towering candelabras casting flickering light on polished floors, velvet drapes, and tables that groaned under the weight of silver platters heaped with delicacies. Musicians tuned their instruments, and the faint scent of spiced meats, roasted game, and fresh bread mingled with the sweet perfume of flowers adorning the tables. To the casual observer, it was a scene of grandeur and celebration, a spectacle to delight nobles and visiting dignitaries. But beneath the glittering display, Countess Isolde moved like a conductor orchestrating every detail, each gesture and glance carefully calculated to ensure the evening unfolded according to her silent, precise plan. Guests arrived in ornate carriages, their dresses and robes a riot of color and silk, their jewelry catching the candlelight as if to compete with the brilliance of the room itself. Courtiers greeted each other with practiced smiles and exaggerated bows, their eyes darting, searching for signs of advantage or weakness. Every handshake, every curtsy, every polite exchange was a game of subtle power, and Isolde watched them all with unerring attention. She noted who lingered too long in conversation, who avoided her gaze, who seemed nervous despite the laughter and music. To the untrained eye, she appeared radiant, effortlessly charming, yet every smile concealed a mind at work, calculating, plotting, and preparing for the night's dark culmination. As the feast commenced, the clinking of goblets and silverware created a hypnotic rhythm, masking the tension simmering beneath the surface. Servants moved with precision, filling chalices, offering platters of roasted pheasant, spiced venison, and delicate pastries, their eyes occasionally flicking to Isolde for approval. Even the positioning of each guest had been considered. Rivals placed close to one another, allies nearby, observers at the edges. It was subtle, almost invisible to the untrained, yet every placement carried meaning, every proximity designed to elicit a reaction, to test nerves, to manipulate perception. The entire evening became a stage, and Isolde the master playwright, orchestrating not just a feast but the unfolding of destiny itself. Conversations flowed with practiced levity, laced with hidden barbs, compliments that cut deeper than any dagger, and laughter that disguised envy and fear. Courtiers exchanged stories of recent hunts, diplomatic victories, and minor scandals, unaware that their words were catalogued, analyzed, and remembered by the Countess. She listened with an almost imperceptible intensity, every shift in tone, every hesitation, every glance serving as data to refine her plans. Meanwhile, subtle gestures, an intentional spill of wine, a misplaced chair, a candle slightly closer to a particular guest, hinted at her control over the environment. These small manipulations were invisible to all but the most attentive, yet they created an atmosphere of tension, a sense of anticipation that something extraordinary and terrifying was about to occur. As the evening deepened, the music swelled, and the laughter grew louder. The darkness of Isolde's intent remained hidden beneath her radiant smile. She moved from table to table, engaging with each guest, her words carefully chosen, her demeanor flawless. To those she spoke with, she appeared gracious, witty, and utterly charming. Yet those closest, the few who could read beyond the facade, might have sensed an unspoken edge, a cold deliberation, an intensity in her eyes that betrayed her control over the room. It was a calm that unnerved without revealing its purpose, a quiet dominance that demanded attention while concealing danger. The feast itself was a masterclass in sensory manipulation. The richness of the food, the cadence of the music, the warmth of flickering candles, all served to lull the guests into a state of comfort and distraction, a perfect cover for what was to come. Isolde's rivals, laughing and drinking, oblivious to the web closing around them, were the last to sense the significance of subtle changes. A toast made at precisely the right moment, a wine goblet touched with deliberate intent, the faintest rearrangement of seating that would later determine fate. Every movement, every sound, every seemingly inconsequential act was part of a larger, horrifying design, executed with the meticulous care of someone who understood the art of control and the inevitability of consequence. As the evening progressed, the narrative tension built like a low, insistent drumbeat. Eyes darted, laughter became more strained, and the audience, though unaware, could almost feel the storm brewing within the castle walls. Isolde's actions were invisible, yet their impact would soon become undeniable. The guests, immersed in the spectacle and the performance, were unwitting participants in a carefully choreographed drama, that would turn their evening from celebration to nightmare. The air seemed heavier, charged with the unspoken promise of revelation, a tension that grew with every toast and every shared dish. And then, beneath the surface of the banquet, the first subtle signs of impending horror began to emerge. A spilled wine glass here, a misplaced napkin there, a whispered glance exchanged between servants who understood far more than they should. These small details, unnoticed by most, hinted at the precision and forethought behind every action of Countess Isolde. The stage was set, the players positioned, and the silent clock ticking toward a moment that would forever change the course of the night. It was not merely a feast, it was the prelude to terror, a carefully constructed spectacle designed to shock, manipulate, and ultimately eliminate the obstacles standing in her way. By the time the candles burned low and the music reached its crescendo, every guest had unknowingly become part of Isolde's design. The hall, once a place of laughter, warmth, and celebration, held the eerie stillness of anticipation, a silence pregnant with threat. The contrast between the visible beauty of the feast and the invisible darkness lurking beneath created a tension so thick it could almost be felt. Every moment was a deliberate step toward the inevitable, every interaction a thread in a web that only one mind had woven with absolute clarity. The feast of fate had begun, and its consequences would ripple far beyond the castle walls, leaving horror, disbelief, and fascination in its wake. The feast, which had begun as a glittering display of wealth and elegance, transformed slowly, almost imperceptibly, into a chamber of horror. Countess Isolde's plan, executed with cold precision, began to take its deadly form, invisible to all but the few who could sense the tension behind her controlled movements. It started subtly, with small disruptions that might have seemed accidental. A glass shifted too close to the edge, a servant appearing unusually near one table, a candle flame dancing erratically, casting shadows that seemed alive. The guests remained unaware, their minds occupied by conversation and indulgence, yet the air carried a new, oppressive weight, a subtle but undeniable sense that something had shifted. The beauty of the hall now seemed deceptive, a gilded trap where danger lurked silently beneath the splendor. Isolde moved with a deliberate calm, gliding from table to table, her gestures graceful, her smiles radiant, yet her mind was calculating, measuring the precise moment for action. Every glance she cast, every word she uttered, served to maintain the illusion of normalcy while orchestrating a series of events that would leave chaos in its wake. She had anticipated the reactions of her rivals, predicted their movements and hesitations, and prepared contingencies for every conceivable scenario. It was a masterclass in control, a chilling demonstration of how one mind, guided by ambition and meticulous planning, could manipulate an environment to absolute effect. As the evening progressed, the first casualties fell, though their deaths were initially masked by the confusion and noise of the feast. A sudden stumble, a faint cry, a sudden stillness at a table. Each incident seemed isolated, almost accidental, yet each was a deliberate stroke in Isolde's calculated design. Panic began to ripple subtly through the room, a barely perceptible tremor that only heightened the suspense. Guests glanced at one another with confusion and unease, their smiles faltering as the pattern of disruption became undeniable. What had seemed a luxurious celebration was now a stage for terror, and the audience, the courtiers themselves, were trapped within a performance they had never agreed to witness. The silence that enveloped the true violence was perhaps the most chilling element. There were no shouts, no screams, no clattering of weapons that would normally announce carnage. Instead, the killings occurred with a quiet efficiency that magnified the horror, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. Each death was precise, leaving little trace of struggle, yet the psychological impact on survivors was devastating. Guests, initially incredulous, began to grasp the enormity of the events, and fear spread like wildfire, subtle yet unstoppable, infecting even the bravest hearts. The contrast between the opulent surroundings and the brutal reality created a tension that made every shadow, every flicker of candlelight, and every movement of a nearby hand seem loaded with potential danger. Isolde's mastery lay not only in her physical execution, but in her psychological manipulation. She understood the terror that arises not from noise but from the unseen, from the knowledge that a threat exists yet cannot be fully comprehended or predicted. Courtiers scanned the room, seeking a cause, a source, a rationale. But all they found was a carefully maintained facade of elegance and composure. The Countess's presence was both comforting and terrifying. Her radiant demeanor reassured some, while her calculated calm reminded others that the perpetrator of the horror could be standing mere feet away, smiling, conversing, entirely unnoticed. The impact of the killings extended beyond the immediate physical danger. Those who survived were forced to confront the fragility of their own security, the realization that wealth, status, and power offered no protection against a mind as relentless and precise as Isolde's. Panic and suspicion began to spread, creating tension and mistrust among those who had previously shared camaraderie and laughter. Friends turned wary, eyes shifted constantly, and the once cohesive social structure began to unravel. Fear became a currency, and every gesture, every glance, every whisper carried weight and consequence. The psychological toll was as significant as the physical, and Isolde understood this fully, exploiting it to reinforce her control and dominance even as the horror unfolded. The hall itself seemed complicit in the terror, its opulence now grotesque in the context of death. Candles flickered across the polished surfaces, casting elongated shadows that resembled lurking figures. Silverware, once symbols of refinement, glinted like cold instruments of menace. The tapestries that depicted heroic ancestors seemed almost accusatory, as though the ghosts of history were observing the unfolding violence and recording the horrors for eternity. In this setting, every detail amplified the tension, every decorative element became a part of the sinister choreography, and the very beauty of the space contrasted painfully with the brutality of the events taking place. Amid the chaos, Countess Isolde remained untouchable, a calm figure in the center of the storm. She had anticipated the panic, the confusion, and the attempts at resistance. Every contingency had been considered, every risk accounted for, and her rivals fell into their fates with a terrifying inevitability. Her mastery of both environment and human psychology created a scenario in which escape or intervention was almost impossible. The hall, which had once been a place of laughter and celebration, had been transformed into an arena of fear and silent death, each moment carefully controlled by a single, calculating mind. By the end of the night, the room was a tableau of horror. Some guests had fallen, others survived but were paralyzed with shock, and all bore witness to a precision of cruelty that defied understanding. The silent carnage had shattered the perception of safety, left indelible marks on memory, and exposed the terrifying truth of Countess Isolde, that brilliance, ambition, and calculation, when combined with a complete disregard for human life, could create horror so profound it would echo through history. In that hall, beneath the flickering candlelight, the glittering decorations, and the facade of nobility, the darkness of one woman had been unleashed, leaving nothing untouched, nothing safe, and nothing the same. The morning after the feast, the castle was a place transformed, no longer a sanctuary of elegance and celebration, but a theater of suspicion and unease. Courtiers moved quietly through shadowed corridors, their footsteps hesitant, their glances sharp and calculating. Conversations that once flowed freely now stumbled over careful words, every phrase weighed and measured, every laugh suspicious. The memory of the previous night's events lingered in the air like smoke, invisible but suffocating, twisting trust into doubt and friendship into wary observation. No one could say precisely what had occurred, yet everyone felt the presence of something dreadful, something orchestrated by a hand far more skilled than mere chance could explain. Rumors spread like wildfire, whispered in hushed tones behind heavy curtains or over the clinking of breakfast cups. Some spoke of accidents, claiming misfortune and fate had conspired against those who had fallen. Others were bolder, daring to hint at deliberate malice, a carefully plotted act that had taken advantage of the feast's grandeur and the distraction of merriment. As the stories multiplied, fear grew alongside fascination, and no one could resist piecing together fragments, speculating, connecting hints, or imagining possibilities far worse than reality. The uncertainty created a tension almost as powerful as the events themselves. Everyone sensed that Countess Isolde had been at the center, though few dared to voice it openly. Isolde, however, moved with calculated calm through the storm of whispers. Her outward demeanor remained flawless, her smiles charming, her gestures composed. To those around her, she was the same graceful, intelligent noblewoman who had hosted the feast, yet beneath the surface, her mind raced, evaluating, predicting, and planning the next steps. She knew that the fallout from the night could either solidify her position or unravel it entirely, and she treated the emerging suspicion like another piece on her mental chessboard. Every glance exchanged between courtiers, every hesitant bow, every nervous laugh was catalogued, analyzed, and assigned value. She understood that human behavior was as revealing as any document, and she used this insight to maintain control, even as the walls of uncertainty tightened around her. Investigators, both official and unofficial, began to circle, asking pointed questions and seeking explanations. They scoured the hall for clues, inspected the seating arrangements, questioned servants, and examined the details of the feast for anomalies. Every footstep, every whispered comment, every glance in the corridors became part of a tense cat-and-mouse game. Yet for every lead that emerged, Isolde had anticipated it, prepared contingencies, and subtly guided the investigation away from herself. Her brilliance lay in making control appear effortless, in ensuring that even the closest observers were blind to the deliberate precision behind every act. Suspicion existed, yes, but it was a diffuse, tangled web, never focused enough to endanger her directly. The political fallout added layers of complexity. Nobles who had been rivals began to circle one another with caution, unsure who to trust and who to fear. Alliances shifted subtly, sometimes imperceptibly, as courtiers recalibrated relationships in response to the unspoken threat hanging over the castle. Servants, too, became agents of information, sharing details and whispers, but even they were uncertain how much was truth and how much was fabrication. Every conversation became a minefield, and every interaction carried the potential for revelation or betrayal. Isolde thrived in this atmosphere, her ability to manipulate perception and so controlled fear, reinforcing her dominance even as the castle itself seemed to fracture under the weight of doubt. The psychological pressure on the survivors was immense. Those who had witnessed the carnage firsthand or had narrowly escaped death were haunted by memory, trembling in quiet corners, avoiding eye contact, and second-guessing every gesture. Their fear became a tool, both for Isolde and for the court itself, as uncertainty spread like an invisible poison. Even those untouched directly by the massacre found themselves gripped by anxiety, questioning loyalty, morality, and the reliability of their own senses. Panic was subtle yet pervasive, and in this climate of heightened tension, the Countess's mastery over the narrative allowed her to remain untouchable. She did not need to strike again. The mere memory of her calculated actions was enough to bend others to her influence. Every whispered conversation carried the weight of implication, and some began to speculate that the deaths had been not just a random act of violence, but a deliberate statement. The idea of a noblewoman orchestrating such precise horror challenged every expectation of decorum and morality, leaving many stunned, fearful, and fascinated simultaneously. Courtiers debated motives, analyzed seating arrangements, and questioned the loyalty of friends and family alike, creating a fracturing social structure in which truth became elusive. In this way, the power of the Countess extended beyond the act itself. It infiltrated the very minds and perceptions of those who survived, ensuring that the echo of her actions lingered long after the initial horror. Outside the castle, the story began to spread, carried by messengers and travelers. Every retelling added nuance, embellishment, or speculation, amplifying the legend of Countess Isolde. Some spoke in hushed awe of her intelligence and courage. Others trembled at the cold efficiency with which she had executed her plan. The narrative took on a life of its own, feeding the collective imagination with horror and intrigue. By controlling the timing, the positioning, and the perception of events, Isolde ensured that her influence extended far beyond the walls of her immediate domain, planting seeds of fear, respect, and fascination that would grow into legend. Through it all, Isolde's calm remained unbroken. While the world around her became tangled in suspicion, fear, and speculation, she navigated the emerging chaos with unparalleled skill. She allowed the whispers to circulate, the doubts to fester, and the investigations to falter, all while maintaining the public appearance of grace and propriety. The hunt for answers became a game, one that she alone understood the rules of, and one in which she always remained several moves ahead. Every suspicion that arose was anticipated, every accusation deflected, and every perception manipulated to her advantage. In the corridors, in the halls, and in the minds of her rivals and allies alike, Countess Isolde's dominance was now absolute, maintained not through violence alone, but through the psychological terror of uncertainty and control. By the end of the week, the castle was transformed. Trust had fractured, alliances shifted, and the very air seemed charged with fear and fascination. The whispers of the feast, of deaths, of deliberate cruelty, circulated endlessly, creating an atmosphere in which everyone felt vulnerable, observed, and powerless to act. Countess Isolde had achieved not only her immediate goals, but had extended her influence through fear and calculation. The hunt, the whispers, and the suspicion had become instruments of power, tools she wielded silently, ensuring that no one could challenge her without risking destruction, and that the memory of her dark brilliance would linger in the minds of all who had witnessed or heard of her deeds. In the weeks and months that followed the infamous feast, the consequences of Countess Isolde's actions began to ripple through the castle and beyond, leaving a landscape forever altered by fear, fascination, and whispered legend. Some nobles had survived, yet their confidence and sense of security were shattered. Those who had witnessed the silent carnage could not forget the precision, the calmness, and the terrifying calculation of a woman who had wielded death as effortlessly as one might lift a wine glass. Conversations in corridors were now cautious and deliberate, laughter rare and fleeting. Trust, once a cornerstone of courtly interaction, had become a fragile, almost mythical concept, and suspicion lingered like a fog that refused to lift. Countless attempts were made to investigate, to assign blame, to understand the impossible. Messengers and courtiers carried reports, and minor inquiries were conducted, but each effort seemed to dissolve under the weight of Isolde's subtle manipulation. She had anticipated suspicion, planned for scrutiny, and woven her narrative with such precision that proof of her involvement remained elusive. Her public persona remained untarnished. She attended gatherings, smiled graciously, and offered counsel to others with the same charm that had defined her before. Yet beneath that calm exterior, every move was calculated to maintain control, to ensure that no one could mount a challenge without risking their own downfall. The castle itself seemed to respond to her presence. Spaces that had once been lively with music and conversation were now tinged with wariness. Courtiers glanced over their shoulders, servants whispered of shadows that seemed too still, and even the architecture felt heavier under the weight of collective dread. Isolde's influence was not merely political or social. It had seeped into the very atmosphere, shaping perception, altering behavior, and reinforcing her dominance through fear and uncertainty. Every corridor, every chamber, every dining hall became a reminder that one mind had orchestrated events with a precision and detachment that few could comprehend. The legacy of her actions extended beyond the immediate circle of the court. Stories of the feast, the deaths, and the cold brilliance of Countess Isolde spread among the nobility, reaching distant courts and travelers who carried the tale like a dark warning. Some spoke of her as a figure of fear and fascination, a woman whose intelligence and ruthlessness exceeded expectations and whose presence commanded attention even in her absence. Others were drawn to the legend, captivated by the audacity, skill, and psychological mastery that allowed a single individual to bend a world of peers to her will. In this way, Isolde's influence transcended the castle walls, embedding itself in the collective imagination of an entire generation. Yet there were human costs that even her intellect could not erase. Families of the deceased grieved, angered, and sought justice in a world that often placed nobility above accountability. Survivors grappled with trauma, haunted by the memory of what they had witnessed and the realization that proximity to power could mean exposure to unimaginable danger. Emotional scars lingered, silently shaping the behavior and decisions of those who remained. The contrast between her public image and the private terror she had wrought created a complex legacy, one in which admiration, fear, and moral uncertainty intertwined. It was a legacy as dark and intricate as the mind that had orchestrated it. Historically, Countess Isolde's story became more than the account of a single act of calculated murder. It evolved into a reflection on ambition, morality, and the nature of power. Scholars, chroniclers, and storytellers debated her motivations, her psychology, and her genius. Yet even centuries later, questions remained unanswered. Was she driven purely by ambition, by self-preservation, or by a fascination with control and domination? The ambiguity of her character only heightened the legend, ensuring that the tale would endure, studied, feared, and retold with awe and horror alike. Ultimately, the unraveling of events and the subsequent legacy revealed a chilling truth. Brilliance and cruelty, when combined, can reshape not only individual lives but entire social landscapes. Countess Isolde had demonstrated that the facade of elegance and nobility could conceal a mind capable of orchestrating horror with meticulous precision, and that fear, once seated, could secure dominance as effectively as any weapon. Her story remained a cautionary tale, a dark chapter in history that reminded generations that power, intellect, and ambition, when untethered by morality, could produce consequences that echoed far beyond the walls of a single castle. Even as time passed and the castle returned to a semblance of normalcy, the legend of Countess Isolde endured, etched into memory and narrative, a reminder of the terrifying potential of human cunning and the fragile boundary between sophistication and savagery. Those who told her story did so in hushed tones, aware that the true horror lay not only in the events themselves, but in the realization that such calculated darkness had existed, almost unnoticed, behind the glittering facade of nobility. It was a legacy that could never be erased, a shadow that stretched across history, and a testament to a woman whose mind had turned a royal feast into an unforgettable nightmare. Countless years after the infamous events of the royal feast, the story of Countess Isolde endures not only as a tale of horror, but as a meditation on the nature of power, ambition, and human darkness. Her life, her calculated precision, and the silent carnage she orchestrated offer more than a narrative of historical violence. They present a window into the mind of someone who understood the intricate interplay between perception, fear, and control. Historians and storytellers alike have pondered why such brilliance could be intertwined with cruelty, and why a woman capable of grace, charm, and intellect could also embody terror with such elegance. The fascination lies not merely in the events themselves, but in the psychological tapestry that underpins them, a chilling reminder that sophistication and savagery are not always mutually exclusive. Power, as demonstrated by Isolde, is often most absolute when it is invisible. The manipulation of circumstance, the control of perception, and the orchestration of fear allowed her to dominate her world without the overt use of force. The brilliance of her strategy was in its subtlety. The silent carnage was devastating not only because of the deaths themselves, but because it shattered trust, destabilized relationships, and instilled a pervasive sense of vulnerability. Her influence extended far beyond the immediate victims, infiltrating the thoughts, emotions, and behaviors of those who survived and even those who only heard her story. Fear, once sown, became an instrument of power, proving that the mind can be as potent a weapon as any blade or dagger. Yet there is a paradox inherent in Isolde's story. The same mind capable of extraordinary intellect, meticulous planning, and strategic brilliance was also capable of acts that defy conventional morality. Her actions challenged the boundaries between genius and monstrosity, inviting reflection on what drives humans to commit calculated acts of destruction. Was it ambition unchecked by conscience, a desire for control beyond the ordinary, or a darker curiosity that sought to test the limits of influence over life and death. The absence of a clear answer only deepens the fascination, illustrating how power, when combined with intellect and a lack of restraint, can produce outcomes that are both awe-inspiring and horrifying. The feast and the events that followed stand as a metaphor for the duality of human nature. The glittering hall, the sumptuous food, the laughter of courtiers, these are images of civilization, refinement, and culture. Yet beneath this veneer of beauty lies potential for chaos, betrayal, and violence. Countess Isolde's actions exposed the fragility of order and the ease with which a single, determined individual could disrupt even the most stable of social structures. The contrast between the facade of elegance and the underlying darkness is a lesson that transcends history, reminding us that appearances often conceal deeper truths, and that brilliance without morality can be as dangerous as ignorance with malice. Her story also serves as a cautionary tale about the human capacity for observation and manipulation. Isolde understood that control begins in the mind, that fear and anticipation can shape behavior as effectively as any physical threat. By anticipating responses, predicting vulnerabilities, and orchestrating circumstances, she created a reality in which outcomes aligned with her desires. Those who underestimated her, or who assumed that beauty, charm, or social grace were sufficient shields, discovered too late the depth of her calculation. The psychological dimension of her power ensured that her influence lingered long after the initial events, a haunting reminder of the reach of intellect guided by ambition and devoid of empathy. The legacy of Countess Isolde is thus both horrifying and instructive. It reminds us that darkness can coexist with sophistication, that terror can be cloaked in charm, and that the human mind, when unrestrained by moral constraints, can orchestrate acts that reverberate far beyond the immediate moment. Her story encourages reflection on the nature of leadership, influence, and the ethical responsibilities that accompany intelligence and ambition. It also warns that those who ignore subtle power dynamics, who assume civility equates to safety, or who underestimate the potential for calculated malice, may find themselves swept into events far beyond their control. Ultimately, the tale of Countess Isolde endures because it speaks to the eternal tension between light and darkness within human nature. The feast, the silent carnage, the whispers of suspicion, and the careful orchestration of power reveal the extraordinary consequences when intellect and ambition converge with cruelty. It is a story that fascinates and terrifies, a story that continues to be recounted across centuries, a reminder that the shadow of a single, brilliant mind can extend far beyond the walls of any castle, shaping history and haunting memory. In contemplating her life, one is forced to confront uncomfortable truths about power, morality, and the potential for darkness that exists in us all.